A year ago, our house was never quiet. Our daughter was 3 years old, and she moved like the world was a playground built just for her. If she was awake, she was running. If she wasn't running, she was climbing. And if she wasn't climbing, she was dancing, spinning in the living room with her arms stretched wide, laughing like she'd just discovered happiness for the first time every single day. We used to joke that she didn't walk anywhere. She launched herself from place to place. Dance lessons became our solution and our joy. Every week, we packed her and her older brother into the truck, drove across town, and watched her twirl in a room full of mirrors that reflected her excitement back at her 100 times over. She wasn't particularly coordinated, but she didn't care. She danced like her body trusted the world completely, like nothing bad could ever happen as long as music was playing. The day everything changed started like every other day. Ordinary, almost boring. I remember thinking about dinner, about laundry, about whether we had enough milk in the fridge. My husband was driving. I was half turned in my seat, watching the kids in the back. Our daughter had fallen asleep, her head tilted gently toward her brother, one small hand resting on her lap. I remember smiling at how peaceful she looked, how rare it was for her to be still. We were minutes from home. I didn't see the other car until it was too late. There was no dramatic build-up, no warning, just the sudden sound of metal colliding with metal, the sickening force of impact, and the world snapping violently sideways. The noise was deafening. Glass shattered. The truck lurched. My body slammed against the seatbelt so hard it stole the air from my lungs. Then silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel real, like your ears are ringing and your brain hasn't caught up yet. I remember screaming my daughter's name before I even understood why. My husband was already out of the truck yelling for help. Our son was crying, terrified but moving. But our daughter was too still. They hit the door. She was sitting next to her. I don't remember the ambulance ride clearly. I remember lights. I remember holding her tiny hand and begging her to wake up. I remember a paramedic telling me to stay calm and a voice that sounded practiced, like he'd said it too many times before. At the hospital, everything blurred together. Forms, hallways, doctors speaking in careful tones that avoided promises. She went into surgery almost immediately. We waited for 2 days. 2 days sitting in stiff chairs, drinking bad coffee, staring at doors that never opened fast enough. 2 days of bargaining with a universe I had never questioned before. I would have given anything to go back to that moment in the truck and change 1 second, 1 turn, 1 breath. When the surgeon finally came out, I knew from his face before he said a word. She was alive, but her neck had been broken. Her spinal cord was damaged. Stable didn't mean healed. Stable didn't mean okay. It just meant she wasn't dying anymore. They told us she would never walk again. I remember nodding like I understood what they were saying, even though my brain refused to accept it. She was 3. She still slept with a stuffed animal. She still asked why the moon followed the car at night. How do you tell a child like that what paralysis means? How do you explain that her body would never do the thing it had loved most? When she woke up, she didn't cry at first. She just looked confused. She asked why her neck hurt, why she couldn't move, why mommy was crying again. And from that moment on, the house that had once been filled with music and motion became painfully quiet. The smile that used to come so easily disappeared. She watched her brother run, climb, swing, and laugh from the sidelines. Sometimes she tried to smile for him. Sometimes she didn't try at all. At the playground, other kids stared. Some asked questions too loud. Some whispered. Some parents pulled their children away like disability was contagious. I caught my husband crying in the garage late at night more than once. I thought he just needed space. I thought grief was pulling us in different directions, quietly but inevitably. I didn't know then that while I was drowning in the present, he was planning something for the future. And I had no idea that a year later, on her birthday, everything would change if only for a moment. Asterisk. The months after the accident blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable. Days felt endless, while weeks disappeared without warning. Our lives became measured in appointments instead of memories. Physical therapy sessions, follow-up scans, meetings with specialists who spoke gently but never softly enough to hide the truth. Every hallway in the hospital smelled the same, and every room carried the same weight of other families. Grief hanging in the air. Our daughter learned new words too quickly, words no 3-year-old should have to know. Wheelchair brace, nerves. She learned how to sit still, something she had never mastered before, not because she wanted to, but because her body no longer gave her a choice. The cruel irony of that was something I couldn't think about for too long without feeling sick at home. Everything changed. We rearranged furniture, built ramps, removed things we never noticed before. Small steps, narrow spaces, tiny obstacles that suddenly felt enormous. The house became quieter, slower, heavier. Music still played sometimes, but she didn't dance anymore. She watched instead, and watching hurt her in a way no physical injury ever could. She asked questions we didn't know how to answer. Why can't I chase him? Why do my legs sleep all the time? When will I run again? Every time, my heart broke in a new way. We learned how to redirect instead of explain, how to comfort without lying, how to smile while swallowing our own pain. Some days she handled it better than we did. Other days, she cried until her tiny body shook, angry at a world that had taken something she didn't even understand yet. The playground became the hardest place. She loved it and hated it at the same time. She laughed when her brother pushed her swing, but the laughter never lasted. Eventually, she would go quiet, watching him jump off, climb higher, move freely. I saw the exact moment when the realization hit her every single time. The pause, the stiffening of her shoulders, the way her eyes followed him and then dropped. That's when she started avoiding mirrors. My husband changed too. He became quieter, more distant, not cold, just inward. He threw himself into work, into projects around the house, into anything that kept his hands busy. I assumed it was his way of coping. We didn't talk about blame, but it hovered between us like a shadow. I could see it in his eyes every time he looked at her. The unspoken, if only I didn't know then that guilt had turned into determination. Her 4th birthday came and went quietly. We kept it small. Family, cake, soft laughter that tried too hard to sound normal. She smiled for photos, but it didn't reach her eyes. When the candles were blown out, she didn't make a wish. That hurt more than anything else. As the year stretched on, hope became something fragile. Not gone but careful. We celebrated small victories. Better arm strength, faster wheelchair turns, new ways she learned to play. But underneath it all was the constant reminder of what she had lost. Then, slowly, I started noticing things. My husband spending long hours in the garage again, but this time, not crying, measuring, sketching, building something I wasn't allowed to see. When I asked, he brushed it off, said it was nothing important, but his eyes gave him away. There was purpose there, focus, something I hadn't seen since before the accident. Our daughter's 5th birthday started like any other day. Balloons, pancakes, presents stacked in bright paper. She smiled politely, thanked everyone, opened gifts with quiet appreciation but no excitement, no spark, until my husband wheeled out the last gift. And in that moment, I realized the months of silence, the late nights, the hidden plans. None of it had been nothing, it had been everything. And what she was about to receive wasn't just a present, it was a miracle built with love, patience, and hope. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. None of us did really, not completely. My husband rolled the gift into the living room slowly, carefully, like it was fragile in a way that had nothing to do with materials. It was covered with a plain sheet, not wrapped like the other presents, and for a moment the room went quiet in that heavy, expectant way where everyone knows something important is about to happen. Our daughter tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her face. "What's that?" she asked softly. My husband knelt down in front of her, his hands shaking just a little as he reached for the sheet. I could see it then, the nerves, the fear, the hope all tangled together. This wasn't just a gift. It was a question, a risk, and I suddenly understood why he had kept it hidden for so long. When he pulled the sheet away, I felt my breath catch. It was a small custom-built support frame, brightly colored, smooth-edged, and clearly made for a child. It had padded braces for her legs, a supportive harness for her torso, and adjustable handles she could grip with her hands. It wasn't a wheelchair. It wasn't something she'd ever seen before. It was a way to hold her upright. "I made it for you," he said, his voice unsteady, "so you can stand." For a moment, she just stared at it. Then she looked at him, then at me. Her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in almost a year, uncertainty mixed with hope. "Stand?" she asked, like the word itself was fragile. My husband nodded, "With help. Just for a little while, if you want to try." I didn't realize I was crying until tears blurred my vision. All those nights in the garage, all that quiet grief, I finally understood. He hadn't been running from the pain. He'd been building something to fight it. We moved slowly, carefully. He explained every step to her, letting her feel in control. He helped guide her into the frame, adjusted the straps, made sure nothing hurt. When he finally lifted her gently into position, something incredible happened. She was upright, her legs were supported, her body was held steady. She wasn't walking, not really, but she was standing, taller, eye level with her brother for the first time in a year. Her hands gripped the handles, her arms shaking with effort, her body unsure of itself in a position it hadn't known for so long. For a second, she looked scared, then she laughed. It wasn't a small laugh. It wasn't polite or careful. It was loud and surprised and full of disbelief, like she'd just discovered a secret the world had tried to hide from her. She threw her head back and laughed until she snorted, the way she used to when she danced. "I'm tall," she shouted. Her brother froze, then laughed too, running up to her like she'd just performed magic. He hugged her waist, careful but excited, and for the first time in a year, they were face to face, no chair, no downward glances, no separation. My husband covered his mouth with his hand, his shoulders shaking. I'd never seen him cry like that, not even at the hospital. This was different. This was release. We didn't let it last long, just a few minutes. Enough to be safe, enough to be special. When we helped her sit back down, she didn't look sad. She looked full that day. She spent hours talking about it, about being tall, about standing next to her brother, about how it felt. She laughed more in one afternoon than she had in the entire year before. And that night, When I tucked her into bed, she smiled at me and said, "Mummy, I felt normal today." I didn't sleep at all that night because while part of me was overwhelmed with joy, another part understood something important. This wasn't a cure. It wasn't magic. But it was something just as powerful. It was dignity. It was freedom, even if only for moments. And it was only the beginning. The days after her birthday felt lighter, like someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed shut for a year. Nothing about our reality had magically changed. She was still paralyzed, still needed assistance, still faced limits no child should ever have to face, but something inside her had shifted. And once it did, it started changing all of us. She asked to use the standing frame every morning, not for long, never pushing past what her body could handle, but just enough to feel tall again, just enough to look at the world from a different angle. My husband adjusted it constantly, fine-tuning the straps, patting the braces, sanding down edges, making it safer, more comfortable, more hers. He watched her like an engineer and a father at the same time, measuring every reaction, every smile, every wince. And she smiled. A lot. Her therapists were stunned when we showed them. They examined it carefully, tested its stability, asked 100 questions. Eventually, one of them smiled and said, "This is really well designed." I saw my husband straighten a little at that, pride flickering through the exhaustion. They explained the benefits of standing: circulation, digestion, bone strength. But what mattered most to us was something they couldn't chart out. Her confidence came back at the playground. She didn't watch from the sidelines anymore. She stood in the frame while her brothers swung, laughed, and showed off. Kids still stared sometimes, but she didn't notice the same way. She waved, she talked, she felt seen without feeling small. And slowly, other children stopped staring and started asking questions instead. "Can I help? Does it hurt? Can we play?" For the first time since the accident, she felt included. My husband stopped disappearing into the garage at night. Instead, he came inside earlier, sat with us longer, laughed again. One night I finally asked him why he'd kept it all from me. He took a long breath and said, "Because if it didn't work, I didn't want you to lose hope too." That broke me. He had been carrying his grief and his hope alone so the rest of us wouldn't have to. We talked more after that, about the accident, about the guilt we both carried, about the things we could never change and the things we still could. We cried together in the living room, our daughter asleep nearby, the standing frame resting quietly in the corner like a promise. She started dancing again in her own way. Music still lit something up inside her. Sometimes she stood in the frame and swayed her upper body. Sometimes she sat and moved her arms, her head, her hands. It wasn't the same dance she used to love, but it was hers. And when she danced, she laughed. I realized then that normal doesn't mean unchanged. It means adapted. It means finding joy where you can, even if it looks different than you imagined. Her laughter began to fill the house again. Not constantly, not effortlessly, but genuinely. And every time it did, it felt like a small miracle all on its own. But the biggest surprise was yet to come, because one afternoon, during a routine therapy session, something happened that none of us were prepared for. And when it did, hope stopped feeling fragile. The therapy room had become familiar in the same way hospitals and clinics always do: too familiar, too neutral, too full of quiet expectation. We'd been there dozens of times before. Same mats on the floor, same bright posters on the walls, same calm voices from professionals who learned how to balance honesty with hope. I didn't expect anything different that day. Neither did my husband, and certainly not our daughter, who rolled in smiling, already asking if she could use the standing frame later. The therapist suggested trying something new, nothing dramatic, just a small adjustment to one of the exercises they'd been working on for months. They secured her safely, explained everything carefully, and encouraged her to focus not on movement, but on feeling, on awareness, on connection. It sounded abstract, almost symbolic, and I braced myself for disappointment before we even began. She concentrated hard, her tongue peeking out slightly the way it always did when she focused. The room went quiet. Even her brother stopped fidgeting. The therapist asked her to imagine pushing down with her foot, not moving it, just thinking about it. I watched her face, every tiny muscle, searching for change. And then it happened. At first I thought I imagined it. A twitch, barely anything. So small I almost dismissed it as wishful thinking. But the therapist froze, eyes widening just a fraction. My husband leaned forward, his breath caught halfway in. "Did you feel that?" the therapist asked gently. Our daughter nodded, confused. "It tickled," she said. They tried again. Same instruction, the same focus. This time there was no doubt. Her toes moved, not much. Not enough to stand, not enough to walk. But they moved. Voluntarily. On command. The room exploded into quiet disbelief. No cheering, no shouting, just hands covering mouths. Eyes filling with tears. Professionals suddenly careful with their words because they understood the weight of what they were seeing. The therapist explained, carefully, that this didn't mean everything would change overnight, that spinal injuries are unpredictable, that progress, if it came, would be slow and uncertain. But what mattered, the thing that made this moment extraordinary, was that the signal was there. The connection hadn't been completely lost. I felt my knees give out. I sat down hard, sobbing, my hands shaking. My husband dropped to the floor beside me, laughing and crying at the same time, his forehead pressed to the mat like he was praying. Our daughter looked between us, startled by our reaction. "Did I do good?" she asked. I pulled her into my arms as carefully as I could. "You did amazing," I said. And for the first time in a year, those words didn't feel like consolation. They felt true. That night, she slept better than she had in months. And so did we. Hope crept back in, not reckless, not overwhelming, but steady. Real. It wasn't about walking. It wasn't about miracles we couldn't guarantee. It was about possibility, about progress, about knowing that her body hadn't given up. In the weeks that followed, therapy changed. Exercises became more focused. Goals shifted. We celebrated millimeters instead of miles. A twitch, a sensation, a moment of control. Each one felt monumental. The standing frame became even more meaningful, not just as a way to feel tall, but as a bridge between where she was and where she might go. My husband continued to modify it, adapt it, improve it, this time, with therapists' input, with professionals validating what he had built with grief and love in a garage, and our daughter, our brave, stubborn, beautiful daughter, started believing in her body again. She still had hard days. She still cried sometimes watching other kids run, but now, those moments were followed by determination instead of despair. She would look at her legs, concentrate, and say, "I'm working on it." And somehow, that made all the difference, because we were no longer just surviving what had happened, we were moving forward together. From that day on, progress stopped being an abstract idea and started becoming something we could measure, even if only in the smallest ways. Therapy sessions became the center of our weeks. We planned everything around them, not out of obligation, but because they felt like stepping stones, each one a chance to discover something new about what her body could still do. The therapists were careful with us. They reminded us often that recovery after a spinal injury isn't linear. There would be gains, plateaus, and setbacks. Hope, they said, had to be managed. But even they couldn't hide their excitement when she continued to respond. Sensation crept back slowly, unpredictably. Sometimes it was a tingling in her feet, sometimes a faint awareness in her legs, sometimes nothing at all. And then, without warning, another tiny victory would appear. Our daughter approached it all with a determination that both inspired and terrified me. She worked harder than any adult I'd ever seen. She concentrated until her little face turned red, celebrating the smallest movements like they were gold medals. She didn't understand fear the way we did. She didn't carry the weight of what could be lost again. She only knew what she wanted, and she went after it with everything she had. At home, the standing frame evolved into something symbolic. It wasn't just equipment anymore. It was part of our daily rhythm. She stood while brushing her teeth. She stood to help stir pancake batter. She stood while dancing, swaying her upper body to music, laughing when she lost balance and caught herself with the handles. Every time she stood, she reclaimed a piece of herself that the accident had tried to take. The emotional changes were just as profound. She stopped avoiding mirrors. She started choosing her own outfits again. Bright colors, sparkles, dresses she loved before the accident. She insisted on being part of everything, even when it was harder. And people noticed. Family, friends, even strangers commented on her confidence, on the way she carried herself, not like a child defined by injury, but like a child defined by resilience. My husband changed too. The heaviness that had settled into him after the accident slowly lifted. He smiled more, slept better, laughed without forcing it. One night, as we watched our daughter stand and wave at herself in the mirror, he quietly said, "I don't feel useless anymore." That sentence hit me harder than anything else. I hadn't realized how deeply the accident had wounded him in ways he never spoke about. We still had hard conversations about the future, about accessibility, about what independence might look like for her as she grew older. Those talks were still painful, but they no longer felt hopeless. They felt informed, grounded, built on reality instead of fear. Then came the day her therapist suggested trying assisted stepping. I remember gripping the edge of the chair so tightly my fingers hurt. The idea felt dangerous, not physically, but emotionally. What if it didn't work? What if we built hope only to watch it collapse again? But our daughter didn't hesitate. She nodded eagerly, eyes bright. With braces, support, and careful guidance, they positioned her. She stood taller than ever. The therapist counted softly, encouraged her to shift weight, to think about moving forward. Her foot lifted barely, just enough to clear the floor, but it lifted the room. Froze. I felt my heart slam into my ribs as tears spilled down my face without permission. My husband made a sound I'd never heard before, half laugh, half sob, and our daughter grinned like she'd just discovered a superpower. "I did it," she said proudly. Yes, she did it. Wasn't walking. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way people imagine. But it was movement, intention, proof. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she looked at me seriously and said, "Mummy, my legs are learning again." And I believed her. Because miracles don't always arrive as lightning bolts. Sometimes they come one small step at a time. From that day on, progress stopped being an abstract idea and started becoming something we could measure, even if only in the smallest ways. Therapy sessions became the center of our weeks. We planned everything around them, not out of obligation, but because they felt like stepping stones, each one a chance to discover something new about what her body could still do. The therapists were careful with us. They reminded us often that recovery after a spinal injury isn't linear. There would be gains, plateaus, and setbacks. Hope, they said, had to be managed. But even they couldn't hide their excitement when she continued to respond. Sensation crept back slowly, unpredictably. Sometimes it was a tingling in her feet, sometimes a faint awareness in her legs, sometimes nothing at all. And then, without warning, another tiny victory would appear. Our daughter approached it all with a determination that both inspired and terrified me. She worked harder than any adult I'd ever seen. She concentrated until her little face turned red, celebrating the smallest movements like they were gold medals. She didn't understand fear the way we did. She didn't carry the weight of what could be lost again. She only knew what she wanted, and she went after it with everything she had. At home, the standing frame evolved into something symbolic. It wasn't just equipment anymore. It was part of our daily rhythm. She stood while brushing her teeth. She stood to help stir pancake batter. She stood while dancing, swaying her upper body to music, laughing when she lost balance and caught herself with the handles. Every time she stood, she reclaimed a piece of herself that the accident had tried to take. The emotional changes were just as profound. She stopped avoiding mirrors. She started choosing her own outfits again. Bright colors, sparkles, dresses she loved before the accident. She insisted on being part of everything, even when it was harder. And people noticed. Family, friends, even strangers commented on her confidence, on the way she carried herself, not like a child defined by injury, but like a child defined by resilience. My husband changed too. The heaviness that had settled into him after the accident slowly lifted. He smiled more. It slept better, laughed without forcing it. One night, as we watched our daughter stand and wave at herself in the mirror, he quietly said, "I don't feel useless anymore." That sentence hit me harder than anything else. I hadn't realized how deeply the accident had wounded him in ways he never spoke about. We still had hard conversations about the future, about accessibility, about what independence might look like for her as she grew older. Those talks were still painful, but they no longer felt hopeless. They felt informed, grounded, built on reality instead of fear. Then came the day her therapist suggested trying assisted stepping. I remember gripping the edge of the chair so tightly my fingers hurt. The idea felt dangerous, not physically, but emotionally. What if it didn't work? What if we built hope only to watch it collapse again? But our daughter didn't hesitate. She nodded eagerly, eyes bright. With braces, support, and careful guidance, they positioned her. She stood taller than ever. The therapist counted softly, encouraged her to shift weight, to think about moving forward. Her foot lifted badly, just enough to clear the floor, but it lifted the room. Froze. I felt my heart slam into my ribs as tears spilled down my face without permission. My husband made a sound I'd never heard before, half laugh, half sob, and our daughter grinned like she'd just discovered a superpower. "I did it," she said proudly. Yes, she did. It wasn't walking. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way people imagine. But it was movement, intention, proof. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she looked at me seriously and said, "Mommy, my legs are learning again." And I believed her, because miracles don't always arrive as lightning bolts. Sometimes, they come one small step at a time. The weeks that followed felt unreal, like we were living in someone else's life. Word spread quickly through the therapy center. Doctors stopped by her sessions just to observe. Therapists from other departments peeked in under the excuse of paperwork. Everyone was careful not to call it a miracle out loud, but you could see it in their faces, the cautious awe, the restrained hope. Our daughter didn't care about any of it. She cared about walking to her brother. That became her goal. Not across a room, not independently, just to him. Every session, she asked how many steps she needed. Every night she practiced in her head, moving invisible legs under her blankets. She talked to them like friends that had been gone for a long time and were slowly finding their way back. At home, life shifted again. The standing frame was still there, but it no longer felt like the end of the road. It was a tool, not a symbol. My husband modified it one last time, then quietly stepped back. His project had done what it was meant to do. It gave her dignity when she needed it most, and time for her body to heal. One afternoon, during a therapy session that felt no different from the rest, she did something no one was prepared for. She let go, just for a second. No hands, no bars, no support. She stood on her own. The room erupted. Not cheers, gasps, the kind that escape before your brain can catch them. The therapist lunged forward instinctively, but our daughter stayed upright, wobbling, laughing, standing. "I'm okay," she said quickly, afraid someone might make her stop. I had to sit down. My legs wouldn't hold me anymore. My husband stared like his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't in the plans. This wasn't on the charts. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. Recovery didn't suddenly become easy after that. There were still bad days, pain, frustration, moments where progress stalled and fear crept back in. But something fundamental had changed. The doctors stopped saying never. They started saying we'll see. And for us, that was everything. Months later, on a warm afternoon, we went back to the playground where she used to cry watching her brother swing. The same swings, the same chipped paint, the same kids running around without a care in the world. That's time. She stood beside us, braces on, holding her father's hand. She took slow, careful steps across the mulch. Not perfect, not fast, but real. Kids stared again. Then one of them smiled. Do you want to play? The girl asked that. Our daughter looked up at us, eyes wide, waiting. I nodded through tears. She nodded back. That was the moment I knew no matter what came next, she would be okay. That night, after both kids were asleep, my husband and I sat on the porch in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't hurt. He finally spoke. I used to think being a good father meant protecting her from everything, he said. Now I know it means believing in her even when the world says not to. I leaned my head against his shoulder, watching the house glow softly behind us. Our daughter didn't just survive. She adapted. She fought. She reclaimed herself. And while she may never live the life we once imagined for her, she will live one filled with strength, laughter, and a kind of courage most adults never learn. That day, her birthday, the standing frame, the first step, the laughter, it wasn't just a miracle, it was proof. Normal isn't walking, normal is hope, and hope came back home.